Okay, welcome back to chapter 18. For this chapter and the next two, chapters 19 and 20, we are going to take a deeper look at qualitative research. We've talked primarily about quantitative so far, really looking at things like numbers and statistical analysis and how do we measure behaviors through frequency or scores on a test, but qualitative research is a little bit different. Now, we have to talk about the fact that qualitative research still plays a really important role for us in the field of social work. A lot of people talk about that qualitative research allows us to go a lot deeper sometimes than quantitative research. According to Rubin and Babbie, it allows us to tap those deeper meanings of particular human experiences. It's also really helpful for us as social workers because it allows us to explore the experiences of others, especially those from marginalized groups, especially when looking at things that aren't easily quantifiable. So thinking about things like politics. If I give you a survey and your option is rate how strongly you feel about an issue or mark your preferred political party, that's a complicated thing. I might get a bunch of people that say, yep, I identify as this or this. But if I can sit down and walk with someone, they might say, well, it's complicated. I agree with these elements of this political party and these elements of this one. And right, you can just get that deeper understanding. We can also look at a lot of things like subcultures, practices. Qualitative research is good for examining the isms, things like sexism or racism or ageism, because again, those can be harder to quantify and measure, and things like motivation to change. You can say you want to change, but that actual motivation and then the process after that takes time. And so qualitative research is good to examine all of those types of issues. I went and found a couple of quick studies. One is from 2017. They looked at ageism among physicians, nurses, and social workers. So a really interesting study where they did focus groups and they asked about opinions. And what they did is they came up with themes, and they noticed that among all these disciplines, there were consistent themes of challenges of working with older individuals and their families, and the role of invisibility and discriminatory communication practices for older individuals. So a really great study, but again, ageism would be really hard to quantify on its own. Dumbrill did a study in 2006 where he looked at the parental experience of child protection intervention. So really looking at parents and interviewing them and hearing their side, their stories. Finally, there's this third one. It says, I've made this my lifestyle now. A lot of times qualitative studies will have like part of a saying from one of the participants in the title, and it's a prospective qualitative study, a motivation for lifestyle change among people with newly diagnosed type 2 diabetes mellitus. So there's a lot of really good things that we can use qualitative research for that may not be as rich if we use quantitative research to study it. So there's several different qualitative approaches that they mention in the book. There's actually a few other ones that I've seen, but in this one, they pick some of the big ones. The first type of qualitative approach is this idea of naturalism. So instead of having people come to you to do a focus group, the idea is that you go out and you observe people in their everyday settings. And as they share their story, you just take it in so that you can share their story. A smaller branch of naturalism is ethnography. And this is focusing on a very, very, very detailed description of something or some group. So some examples that I found online. Codrington wrote a book about the Melanesians back in 1891. So real deep, detailed description. Helene Lawson published a book in 2000 called Ladies on the Lot, Women, Car Sales, and the Pursuit of the American Dream. And Neil Webstale looked at rural women battering in the justice system and ethnography. So these are super detailed description, and they're not really focused on causation or explanations. They're really just describing a group or a culture super, super in depth. But again, it's going into that environment, that naturalist setting. The danger with this approach, right, is you might still have an ethnographic fallacy, which is the idea that we can overgeneralize or oversimplify patterns when we've got such a detailed experience, but it's still a really interesting technique. And if you can ever get a book or a study, it's definitely worth reading. The second type is called grounded theory, and this is really an inductive process. So what you do is you kind of search the literature, you get kind of an idea, but you come in really, really open to interviewing or meeting with a group of people or an individual. What you do is as you're meeting with people about a topic, again, very open, very vague, no preconceived notions, what you do is you start to find patterns and themes. And then as you interview more and more people about this topic, you might start to create some sort of hypothesis. So then you're like, okay, then I'm going to go interview some other people, maybe in a different group or a different setting, and see if that continues to stay true. And then you craft your hypothesis a little more and you refine it as much as you can So at the end, you might get a pretty strong theory out of it, but it's a process and it takes time. And so in a lot of ways, I think it mimics our social work process. You come in, you stay very open, we start gathering information from our clients. We may have a limited overview of them, but it's not until we're in there that we start to learn and ask questions. And then towards the end, we start going, oh, here's where I think the issue might be. Let's see if this kind of a treatment approach would help, right? So again, grounded theory is coming in open and then starting to build and craft your theory and your idea and your hypothesis as you go. They also have something called participatory action research, which has become really popular for social work especially, and it really emphasizes engaging marginalized or vulnerable groups in the research process to act in their own interest. So instead of being the traditional kind of I come in from the outside and I view participants almost as like objects of research, we engage with the people. Maybe I go find their professor or their leaders and work through the process and help them do the study so that they can get the knowledge that they need. In this approach, we view information as power, and that the more we can empower groups by having them learn and build their own knowledge about their own community or own people or own issues, it really empowers them. Finally, they talk about case studies, which is typically a very focused examination of a single case. So looking at one person or one family, one group, one organization, one community, or one society. Typically, it's very description heavy as well. It might have some explanation, like you describe a family and all their different dynamics, and maybe towards the end you start to come up with some explanation. But really, it is another example of a really good way to describe and analyze something that's going on with the single unit. And so typically, it includes looking at evidence like records, observations, interviews, in addition to the observation and engagement with the case that you are studying. Triangulation is really important and comes into play as well. So we may be doing a case study on one individual, interviewing, going in depth, but I may also be interviewing people around that person, looking at records just to verify. The one challenge with case studies is they're not really looking for generalization. They're focusing more on connecting a case study to a particular theory. I think it does set the stage nicely to study phenomena. So let's say we go in and I want to study one elementary school classroom and I get really focused on them. Then I can start to say, ooh, I'm seeing a phenomena here, a bullying, and maybe I go that direction. So it's a really nice way to take a deep dive into a case. Some examples that I found online of this are a single subject case study looking at the effect of acupuncture treatment on hot flush symptoms in a female breast cancer patient. So that's looking at one person. This one is maybe looking at a group, experiences with imposter syndrome and authenticity at research-intensive schools of social work, a case study on Black female faculty, so looking at Black female faculty and their experience. Or you can look at a place or an organization. So this one from 2020 was Roles of Medical Social Workers and Interprofessional Teams, a case study of a Shanghai COVID-19 quarantine center for medical observation. So you can see they're very specific, not a ton of explaining or explanatory work, but really taking a deep dive into the experiences of this one breast cancer patient, Black female faculty, or this quarantine center during COVID. So with qualitative sampling methods, you can use probability sampling methods. Often non-probability methods tend to be more common, in part because our populations tend to be pretty ambiguous. Or sometimes with qualitative research, we're really interested in a new concept or new phenomena. And so it might be easier, let's say you want to look at the experiences of kids who identify as LGBTQ in a more rural town. Well, you might go in and instead of just walking into the school saying, hey, who can I interview? You might meet with the school counselor and she might say, hey, I have a couple kids that might be interested. Let's see if that's an option. So we may use kind of non-probability methods when we are looking at something new or trying to identify a new concept. So a lot of times you'll use things like quota sampling. So you might focus on doing qualitative interviews with people of different groups. When you're looking at an organization, you might interview leaders and workers just to make sure you have equal representation of both. With snowball sampling, you might meet one or two individuals and you start doing interviews and say, hey, spread the word. And so they bring in people that are also in that similar group. You might do deviant case sampling. You find that one person that doesn't fit a regular or a normal pattern and interview them. The risk with deviant case sampling that Rubin and Babbie mentioned is that if we go too extreme, we might distort the topic. And so they recommended that sometimes we can do intensity sampling. So So we're not looking at the extreme cases of an issue, but we're looking at ones that are not the mean, right? So we're not looking at the most angry, the most frustrated, the most upset, but we're also not looking at the neutral. Maybe we're looking at people that are upset and the people that agreed with something and trying to interview them. Qualitative research might use something like critical incident sampling, which is focusing when something happens, negative or positive, and jumping in and doing like a case study or something like that. There's maximum variation sampling, where we try to make sure that we sample all the different facets of a topic. And then homogeneous sampling, where we go really, really deeply with one group. So you could go either way. You might say maximum variation sampling, I am going to focus on this homeless shelter, and I'm going to interview every different type of person that I can in their relationship to this homeless shelter. That would be maximum variation. But I could also say, I really just want to look at young moms between 18 and 25 who have a baby in this homeless shelter, and get very, very narrow and specific of that homogeneous group. A lot of these later ones represent the purposive sampling, right? That idea that you select a sample you think will give you the most comprehensive information about a topic. So lots of different ways that we use non-probability methods to sample people for qualitative studies. Finally, a couple of strengths and weaknesses. The strengths are qualitative research is great. It can examine nuanced behaviors and attitudes, which is something that is so critical. It provides a much deeper understanding of people's experiences. We can't really know what it's like to walk in someone's shoes, but being able to read through a very detailed study to hear the voices of the people really gives us a lot more understanding about something. It has a lot of flexibility. We'll talk about it in the next chapter, but you can change and move and shift versus like I did a study where I had some open-ended questions for survey research. Once it was over, it was over. Versus with a qualitative study, you can go in and say, ooh, this change, I think I'm going to add this question, or ooh, I'm going to re-interview this group again, but focusing on this issue. So a lot of flexibility, and it can have decreased costs because you're not having to pay to sample 1,000 people and pay for Qualtrics or all these different systems or the names or sampling frames. It does have some weaknesses, right? It can be very vulnerable to subjectivity. It has limited generalizability as well. It can be a little bit challenging to say, wow, that was a really good case study, but what are the practical implications for other people in the community based on that? And that's not always as clear. Lastly, the book talks about trustworthiness, which is similar to validity, but for qualitative research. And trustworthiness is basically the idea that you've taken steps to ensure that is a rigorous and well-structured study. You didn't just show up at a random place and start interviewing, right? Trustworthiness is that you went in, you had a purpose, you had a plan. Even if you didn't have a scripted text, you knew kind of what you were looking for, you knew what population you wanted to study, and so you made sure that it was structured and rigorous. So that is the quick overview of qualitative research. For the next chapter, we will dive deeper into how do we actually do it? What are the elements of qualitative research?